Hey guys, this is Dr. Zack Rourk on the PWHC podcast. Today we talk all about conditioning. First thing that we talk about is anaerobic versus aerobic. What kind of sport is hockey? Talk a little bit about VO2 max. Then we talk about some of the mistakes that I see in conditioning for hockey players, a lot of on ice and off ice mistakes that I see. And then finally, we'll talk about exactly what happens in a game from a conditioning perspective and how best to train for it. So give it a listen if you're interested in conditioning for hockey players. Okay, so today we'll talk about conditioning for hockey. And first thing we'll go through are the energy systems involved. And we'll talk about those hopefully in a little bit of a different way than we usually do. Then we're going to talk about repeated sprintability. When we talk about repeated sprintability, we'll talk a little bit about VO2 max and actually why that's not very important. And then lastly, we'll get into the kind of the application. So how should you train for hockey? And when we get into the application, we'll talk about some of the big misconceptions that I see that kind of regularly take place in training. So to start off with the energy system. So a lot of times I'll have parents come up to me and say that hockey is an anaerobic sport. Or I'll have parents come up to me and say, you know, it's really important in hockey to have a good aerobic base or something like that. And what they're talking about are the two kind of broad classifications of energy systems in the human body. The first being the anaerobic system. The anaerobic system is like a high intensity, short burst kind of system. That's a way you could characterize it. And then the aerobic system is like the low intensity, kind of long, slow, steady state. And it's actually interesting because if you look in the lit, depending on the paper, they will characterize hockey as an aerobic sport or as an anaerobic sport. There are actually multiple papers in the lit that say, the opposite. They come to the opposite conclusion. And so what I'm trying to get at is that there's confusion. Some people will say that one is more important than the other, and there's people on both sides. And the reason for that is that hockey is neither an anaerobic sport or an aerobic sport. Actually, like most sports, hockey uses all of the energy systems, and it uses them in an integrated fashion. And the problem that I see, and so I teach at the University of Wisconsin River Falls. I teach a strength and conditioning class in undergrad, and then I teach all of the classes in the master's program, and 6 of the 9 classes in the master's program. And what I see, especially with my undergrad students, is they come out of exercise physiology. They've learned about the energy systems, aerobic, anaerobic, and we talk about like the anaerobic glycolytic and the ATP PCR system as being the two subsystems in the anaerobic system, but it doesn't really matter for this talk. But so they know the systems, and the way that it's taught in school is as if those energy systems exist in a vacuum, right? As if your anaerobic system is independent of your aerobic system. And they're just not. Like if you're sitting here listening to this podcast, in your car, driving somewhere, all of your systems are working right now. Your anaerobic system is working, your aerobic system is working. Now, there is a heavy dependence on your aerobic system, and there's much less of a dependence on your anaerobic system, but they're both working. They're always working. And when you start to exercise at higher and higher intensity, both systems upregulate. And the dependence upon one or the other system, and that's simplified thing. There's more subsystems and things like that, but let's just say there's 2. The dependence on one or the other system, that actually changes instant by instant within your workout. Assuming that your workout has varying levels of intensity and varying levels of maybe output requirements. So here's a situation where that wouldn't be true. That wouldn't be true if you were on a treadmill running at 6 miles per hour, steady state for 30 minutes. If you're doing that, the requirements, the force outputs, the power outputs, the metabolic requirements, they're pretty steady. They're pretty steady and stable. And so you could call that aerobic conditioning. You could say that you're doing an aerobic workout or aerobic training or whatever. And that works in a performance output where the the characteristics and the settings don't change, right? Hockey is not like that at all. Hockey, and I'll get to a breakdown of hockey in a bit here, but really generally speaking, hockey is short bursts of high intensity, which are going to be primarily fueled by your anaerobic system, followed by intermediate to short breaks, right? Of low intensity, two-footed glide, slow skating speed, sitting on the bench, that kind of thing. But it's up and down, and it's all over the place. And so the idea that hockey is aerobic or anaerobic, it's just a non-starter. If you take either of those approaches, your training won't be very good because you're not looking at the actual metabolic demands of hockey at a granular enough level. Okay? So what I would suggest is that we don't look at the energy systems as independent systems, and we don't look at hockey as either aerobic or anaerobic in terms of its metabolic profile. So we have to get a little bit deeper. So getting a little bit deeper. So one more thing I wanted to address off the top is VO2 max. People care about VO2 max in the hockey world because it's measured. It's measured at the NHL Combine. They do it on a bike, which has its own problems. And what you'll find is that hockey players have a VO2 max of between like 47 and 55. That's pretty much all of them. If you're lighter, you're going to have a higher VO2 max because you take your VO2 max in the formula, you divide by body weight. If you're heavier, you're going to be on the lower end. But pretty much any hockey player that's able to play at a relatively high level is going to have a VO2 max of between like 47 and 55. There'll be some outliers that are higher, very few outliers that are lower. But it kind of just is what it is. Just the environment of training for hockey, the repeated sprint environment, the repeated interval environment is going to improve your aerobic energy system to about that point. It's one of those numbers where more is not better. Okay, and a problem with the measurements that we take, so if you measure your bench or you measure your VO2 max or you measure your squat, is once you measure it, what you tell the athlete is, one, it's important, and two, more is better, right? And what I'm saying is VO2 max is not important. It's just a fact. It's just a fact that hockey players at a competitive level will have a VO2 max between like 47 and 55. It's really hard to find a healthy hockey player that is in shape and competing that doesn't have a VO2 max in that range. You can find them, but it's hard. But it's not that the VO2 max is making them good at hockey. It's just that if you're a hockey player, that's about the value you're going to have, right? And then the second piece is that if a 50 is good, then a 51 is better. And if a 51 is better, then a 53 is even better, and a 62 would be better, and a 75 would be better. And that's just not true. Because if everything in the training world is a trade-off. So the higher your VO2 max gets, the lower your maximum power output gets. And the reason that hockey players are in that 47 to 55 range is because there's an ideal trade-off between your aerobic capabilities and your anaerobic capabilities for the requirements of the sport. So what I would say is don't worry about your VO2 max. It'll be right in that slot, and it's fine. It doesn't need to be improved. It doesn't even need to be addressed, especially because, and we'll talk about how we should train later, but the way you would improve your VO2 max if you wanted to get it higher is, one, you would drop weight. If you just lose weight, your VO2 max goes up. And then two, you do long, steady state training at 60 to 70% of your max heart rate. So that's like going for long runs. And that's the opposite of what you want to do for hockey performance training. So don't worry about your VO2 max. Okay, so what should we be worried about? Well, what we should be worried about is called repeated sprintability. And repeated sprintability is a little bit of a black box because it's highly dependent on the sport. So like repeated sprint ability for hockey is different than repeated sprint ability for soccer or repeated sprint ability for lacrosse, right? And so what you have to do if you want to figure out how to train repeated sprint ability for your sport is you look at what's called the time motion analysis. And in hockey, there's really like one time motion analysis that's been done of any use, and it was done by Bracco published in '93. And this is a paper where, well, what they do for this paper is they watch a hockey game and they just watch one player and they track every single movement that that player makes. And then they go back and they start the game over and they watch one other player and they watch every movement that they make. And they track the whole thing and they detail everything out. And what Bracco did was he broke down their movements into two-footed glide, cruising, low intensity, medium intensity, high intensity, two-foot stationary, struggle for puck, and backward skating. And then what he did was he clipped out all the times for how long did they spend on all these things. And the major takeaways from the time motion analysis are that the average duration of any movement or intensity was about 1.8 seconds. So hockey players are constantly changing their movements and or intensities about every 1.8 seconds. And then the high intensity movements, the average length for a high intensity movement, which you could think of as maximum effort, was 2.3 seconds. And the really important takeaway here was that over 80%, and I just rounded and say is about 80% of the time on ice, hockey players are at medium intensity or lower, okay? And medium intensity is like, it's a little bit more than skating at like a cruising pace, okay? So 80% of the time is medium intensity or lower. And that's going to be really important when we talk about how to train. The reason that I bring this paper up is because I see a lot of coaches actually at really high levels. I've talked to strength and conditioning coaches in the NHL where they think of hockey as it's 30 to 45 seconds of maximum effort going as hard as you can because that's how long a shift is. And then it's like 2 or 3 times that amount of time of sitting on the bench, so low intensity. So what I'm going to do for conditioning is I'm going to go as hard as I can for the length of a shift, and then I'm going to rest for 2 or 3 times the length of a shift. So 30 seconds on, 90 seconds off, right? And that has nothing to do with the energy system interaction or the repeated sprint ability that you actually see in hockey. So from this data, how we would categorize the repeated sprint ability for hockey is on average, it's about 2.5 seconds, 2 to 2.5 seconds on, right? So maximum intensity. And then the rest, and this is when you're on ice. So on ice rest is like 8 to 10 seconds. And where I get that from is about 80% of the time on ice is at medium intensity or lower. So that's our rest. And so it's about 20% of the time is at maximum intensity or struggling for the puck. And struggling for the puck are like board battles, and those are usually high intensity efforts. So 20% of the time is maximum intensity struggle for puck. 80% of the time is medium intensity or lower. So that's a 1-to-4 work to rest ratio. It's a 1-to-4 maximum intensity to low intensity ratio. And so if I know that my average duration is around 2 to 2.5 seconds, then I know that, or my average duration of maximum intensity is 2 to 2.5 seconds, then I know that my rest time, or my moderate to low intensity on ice, needs If you like what you learned here, you're going to love training with us. If you live near Edina, Minnesota, go to perfectworldhockey.com/consultation to set up a consultation and come on in and work with us in our gym. If you don't live close to Edina, Minnesota, go to perfectworldhockey.com/remote training to download our app and get started training at your gym with our stuff today. It needs to be 4 times that. So it needs to be 8 to 10 seconds, right? So if you wanted to match the energy system integration or the repeated sprintability characteristics of hockey, you would do maximum intensity for about 2.5 seconds, and then you'd rest for about 10 seconds, and then you repeat that 3 or 4 times, because that would be about the length of a shift. And then you would take your 60 to 90 seconds of sitting on the bench, and then you would rinse and repeat and do that again. And that would be replicating a shift. Okay. So that's kind of like the background analysis that we do when we start to decide how we're going to condition for a sport. And here's kind of a metaphor that I like to use. We talked about how we in school we're taught about energy systems as being these independent systems. You have your aerobic and it works like this. You have your anaerobic and it looks like this, and never the two shall meet, right? Well, that's not how it works in the body at all. In fact, there's a lot of communication. There's a lot of sharing of waste products. There's a lot of sharing of metabolites. There's all kinds of crosstalk between these energy systems. And so if you just train one, you're ignoring the other. And when you ignore the other, you don't develop the ability for those energy systems to, let's say, communicate with each other, right? And the way that they communicate is really important. So here's how I talk about it, and maybe a metaphor, is if you were training a symphony orchestra, let's say that there's these 2 approaches. One of them is you give everybody their sheet music and send them home and say, here's your sheet music, everybody play your parts, and then we'll see you at the recital, right? And that's when we're going to play the show. And so everybody independently, all the different systems or all the different instruments would get better. They'd get better at their particular piece of music. And then they would show up at the show and they would all play their music independently, and it wouldn't be that good. And it wouldn't be that good because what wasn't taken into account was all the communication that actually happens during a symphony orchestra playing. Some of it's visual communication. Some of it is you have to hear what the other instruments are doing. Some of it is you have to see what the conductor is doing, waving his arms around, all that kind of stuff. And none of that has been practiced, right? So that like almost the element of the performance that you don't really think about, the communication between all the different instruments, all the different players, that communication was never practiced. And if it's not practiced, it's not well developed, and it's not going to be very smooth. Okay, so the other approach would be, instead of everybody going and practicing on their own, let's all practice in the same room at the same time with each other, right? And so every practice is not only working on your stuff independently, but it's also working on the integration of your independent work with everybody else's. And so the communication is going to be a lot stronger. Now, this metaphor is not perfect. It's not perfect because it would actually be best for that orchestra to do both. It would be best for the players to practice on their own, because then they can kind of bring their stuff to the show, and then for them to play with everybody so that it can all integrate. And the difference there is that the energy systems don't need practice on their own because they inherently know what to do, if we can talk about them as if they're sentient beings, right? But it's not a perfect metaphor. So the takeaway here is that the energy systems need to practice that integration. And if you don't practice that integration, you miss a huge part of the training. Okay, so how does that show up in the real world? in the real world, what most hockey players feel is they train all summer and then they get to camp and then it takes them about 2 weeks to get their legs under them, right? To get their camp legs or to get like game ready or whatever you might, however they describe it, right? And the problem that they're running into is, yeah, they have all these independently developed energy systems, but there's no integration and they haven't been training the specific repeated sprintability that's required of the sport. And so they feel awful. If instead you do what I'm about to recommend here, this repeated sprint training, what I've found with my athletes when they go to camp is they feel fine right away. They feel like they're in great shape. I just got a call from one of my European athletes, and he said, I felt like I was 6 weeks ahead of everybody in camp because of the way that we condition. And this was his first summer conditioning with us or training with us. And so it was very new to him, and he hadn't ever felt that way before. And again, the reason is because we trained the specific repeated sprintability parameters that hockey is composed of. And so we got the development of all the different energy systems to be exactly what they're supposed to be for the game of hockey. Okay, so what do you do if you want to condition your athletes? So one thing is stop doing Herbies, stop skating lines, stop skating until you're just running out of gas. It's not effective. It's not efficient. It doesn't have anything to do with hockey. There's never a time in hockey where an individual player skates down the ice and then comes back at maximum effort and then goes back and then comes back and then goes back. It doesn't happen. I forgot to talk about this. Most people are surprised when they hear about the breakdown of hockey. And the most surprising fact is that if you look at the two-footed glide and you look at cruising, so two-footed glide, you're just standing still. And then cruising is like taking a stride every, second or so. Over 50% of the time that a hockey player is on the ice during a shift, they're either in a two-footed glide or they're cruising. And the two-footed glide is 40% of the time. Okay? So over half the time, a hockey player is essentially doing nothing on the ice. Over half the time that they're on the ice during a shift, right? And people get confused by this because if you like what you're learning here, you're going to love our free Hockey Hips protocol. It's the same protocol that I've developed over the last 10 years. I use it with all my pros. It's designed to maximize the performance of your hips, to maximize the performance on ice, and to reduce your injury risk on ice. If you want this free protocol, visit us at perfectworldhockey.com/remote training. Usually when you watch hockey, you watch the puck and you watch the action, and everyone around the puck is moving all the time, right? But most players are not near the puck most of the time, right? And so you get these numbers, which are pretty surprising, which is that over half the time, you're basically doing nothing. And so in your conditioning, if you're not basically doing nothing over half the time, you're not conditioning appropriately for hockey, which sounds very counterintuitive because everybody for conditioning just wants to run their athletes into the ground, make them puke, make them skate so hard that their legs fall off, all that kind of thing. It's not very effective. Now, it's hard and it makes it feel like a good workout and you'll sweat and that kind of thing, but it's not efficient, it's not effective, it doesn't match the demands of the sport. Okay, so what do we actually do? What we actually do is we just match those times, right? Now, you can go a little bit higher for a better training effect. So sometimes I'll go up to like 3 or 4 seconds. So a 3 or 4 second, we have these really sports specific sled pushes that I like to use. And there's some videos on YouTube that I've put up about them if you want to see what they are. But we use an acceleration sled push. We use a top end speed sled push. And we'll do them and it turns out to be about depending on the weight of the sled, like 10 to 15 yards. But the reason that we choose 10 to 15 yards is because it's about 2.5 to 4 seconds, depending on the level of athlete and the weight and all that kind of stuff. And so we do these sled pushes for that period of time, and then we just run either a 3-to-1 or a 4-to-1 rest to work ratio. And so that means that if they're pushing for 3 seconds, then they'll be off for 9 or they'll be off for 12, and then they'll go again, right? And we'll do 4 or 5 reps of that. And we do go a little bit over what you would see on the ice. So the way I think about it is we plan for like worst case scenario. So it's a long shift where there's a lot of repeated sprints involved. And so that's why like the total will be longer than a shift will be. So it'll be maybe 50 to 60 seconds instead of down in that 30 to 45. So we'll do those sled sprints with repeats, and that's good. What's better, so that's what you could do off ice. What's better is if you go on ice, and so then the way that we do this is we pick an area on the ice. So one example is you pick below the goal line. So it's the goal line to the boards. So you're working with a pretty small area, and you have a bunch of boards around, and you just flip a puck in, and you have 2 guys go in, and they play keep away, and we'll play for 7, 9, or 11 seconds. And one question I get is like, well, I thought it was supposed to be 2.5 seconds of maximum effort. So why 7? Why 9? Why 11? And the reason is that in that 7, 9, and 11 seconds, they're not going to go maximum effort the whole time. They will have maybe 2 or maybe 3 bursts of maximum effort that last like 1, 1.5, 2 seconds. And then they'll have a couple of seconds in between where they're actually at low intensity because it's like real gameplay. Sometimes we'll use half of a sheet of ice and we'll flip a puck in and it's one-on-one. Sometimes we'll use just a circle. So, one face-off circle, flip a puck in, and then it's one-on-one keep away. Sometimes we won't use the pucks. We'll just play tag. And then we define the space that they can move in. And then we go 7, 9, or 11 seconds. And we do a 2-to-1 rest to work. So if they're on for 7, they're off for 14. And what this gives us is a really close approximation to the work to rest ratios and the energy system integration that you would actually see in hockey. And this is why the on ice is better than the off ice conditioning. It gives us the same movement patterns, right? So they're actually skating. They're actually stopping, starting, changing direction, trying to outmaneuver athletes. They're also, if they don't have the puck, they're doing all of the defensive shadowing movements that they would do in a real game. They're reacting the same way they would in a real game. And so for their energy systems, this is like a live dress rehearsal. If we go back to the recital, or to the symphony metaphor, this is a live dress rehearsal, right? They're actually doing all the things at the same intensities, with the same movements, with the same muscles, with the same sequences that they would do in a game. So these are the ways that we like to condition. I don't like conditioning on a bike. I don't like running for conditioning. If we're going to do running for conditioning, sort of last resort would be short sprints that last 1 to 2 seconds, walk back, rest, and repeat. Make sure that they're competitive so that they're maximum effort. But that's like a last resort. And the reasons for that are biking, the movement patterns are not even similar to hockey, and they reinforce a quad dominant pattern in a hockey player. Running, hockey players are not good at running. At most, I'll sprint a hockey player like 10 yards, and I like to sprint them 7 yards, even more, because the mechanics in the first 7 to 10 yards are similar from sprinting to hockey. But after that, we get into all kinds of mechanics that hockey players are really bad at. And it puts them at a pretty high risk for hamstring issues. So I don't like sprints of more than 10 yards. And like I said, the best way to condition is on ice. But it's not skating lines. It's not doing mountains or herbies or whatever you want to call them, killers. It's trying to replicate the actual requirements of the sport on ice, or if you have to, off ice with a sled that uses the same mechanics that you'd actually use on the ice with the same times and the same intensities and the same work to rest ratios. So that's kind of how we approach conditioning. Again, that's based on, if you want to look it up, there's a paper written by Bracco, Bracko, and it was published in 93, but there's versions of it that were published in 91 as well. And it's really the best time motion analysis that we have right now. It would be great if it was updated, and maybe I'll work on that in my lab here at some point. That's on my to-do list, but it's been on my to-do list for about 10 years, so we'll see if I get to it. Anyways, I hope that was helpful. Thanks for listening. Hope you learned something. This has been a presentation of the PWHT podcast. If you like what you heard here, you're going to love training with us. If you live near Edina, Minnesota, schedule a consultation with us at perfectworldhockey.com/consultation. If you don't live near us and you can't train in person, you're still in luck. Go to perfectworldhockey.com/remote training to download our app. That way you can do all the same training that we do in our gym at your gym at home.